Of the hundreds of victims fed into the meat grinder of the Czechoslovak Stalinist terror, the hangman's noose claimed only one woman. Her name was Milada Horáková. In a courtroom designed as a stage for broken men to recite forced confessions, she was the only one who dared to tear up the script. Despite weeks of psychological evisceration and physical torture that left her a gaunt shadow of herself, she stood before her executioners with a terrifying calmness, refusing to beg, refusing to lie, and refusing to break. And in the dark silence of her final hours, while the rope waited outside, her last act was not a plea for mercy, but a handwritten letter to the 16-year-old daughter she would never see grow up, a testament of love scribbled on the edge of the grave. She was born on Christmas Day, 1901, in a Prague that was not yet the capital of a free country, but a provincial city of ghosts and bureaucrats within the decaying Austro-Hungarian Empire. The streets were patrolled by police in double-breasted coats who spoke German and looked at the Czech population with a mixture of boredom and contempt, creating an atmosphere of suffocating surveillance. The Král family, into which Milada was born, was comfortable, the very definition of the Prague middle class, with her father Czechoslovak Král manufacturing pencils for a living. It sounds mundane, a pencil maker. But in the Král household, the atmosphere was thick with something dangerous, smelling not of cedar wood and graphite, but of sedition. Czechoslovak was a devotee of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who at that time wasn't a president but a radical professor preaching the terrifyingly simple idea that the Czech people had a right to exist on their own terms. Dinner at the Král house wasn't about small talk. It was a seminar on democracy where the emperor in Vienna was a punchline, and the concept of truth was treated like a heavy, valuable physical object. While most children learned that authority was to be feared, that if a policeman speaks, you look down, Milada was taught the opposite. She was taught that authority is often wrong, that a title doesn't make a man smart, and a uniform doesn't make a man moral. She grew up idolizing her father, not as a soldier, but as a civilian who believed in civic duty, a man who lost 2 siblings to tuberculosis, a disease of poverty and overcrowding, which gave him a sharp, painful awareness of social inequality. He didn't shield his daughter from the realities of the world, showing her the slums of Prague as often as he showed her the opera house, ensuring that by the time she was 12, Milada wasn't playing with dolls, but reading the newspapers and tracking the political tensions of an empire that was rotting from the inside out. And then the world exploded in 1914, the summer that ended the old world, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which set the dominoes falling. Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany invaded Belgium. The First World War had begun. For a girl in Prague, the war didn't start with gunfire, but with a terrifying silence as men disappeared from the streets, drafted into an army they didn't care about to fight for an emperor they didn't love, while food disappeared from the markets and truth disappeared from the newspapers. The schools became indoctrination centers where teachers were forced to read official bulletins celebrating glorious Austrian victories, even as death notices piled up in the mailboxes of the students. Milada was 13, then 14, then 15, the impressionable years when you decide who you are. And she watched her neighbors go hungry, watched the police crack down on anyone speaking Czech too loudly, and saw the hypocrisy of adults who cursed the emperor at home but saluted him in the street. She developed a physical revulsion to this hypocrisy, a hatred for the gap between what was said and what was true. In 1916, that revulsion boiled over when she was 15 years old, and the war had been grinding on for 2 years, consuming a generation of men at Verdun and the Somme. A demonstration was organized in Prague, not a violent riot, but a peace march, a collection of students, women, and tired citizens walking through the streets to protest the senseless waste of life, an act that was illegal and considered treason by Austrian authorities. Milada didn't ask for permission. She didn't tell her parents she was going to school. Instead, she went to the march, walking in the crowd, carrying flowers and shouting slogans against the war, transforming for a few hours from a schoolgirl into a citizen. The police crackdown was swift, and the school administration was notified immediately. The headmistress of her girls' grammar school, a rigid pillar of the Austrian establishment, called Milada into her office and offered an implicit choice: apologize, say you were confused, say you were led astray by agitators, show remorse, and you might stay. Milada stood in that office, 15 years old, with hands clasped behind her back, and refused. She admitted she was there, admitted she hated the war, and absolutely refused to say she was sorry. She was expelled. In 1916, for a middle-class girl, expulsion was a catastrophe, a scarlet letter implying she was difficult and unmarriageable. Milada didn't care. The expulsion liberated her, because since the school system had rejected her, she rejected the safety of childhood and found a new school that would take her, though her real education moved to the train stations where she joined the Red Cross. If the Peace March was her political awakening, the Red Cross was her trauma, for she was no longer reading about the war but touching it. The trains would roll into Prague from the Eastern Front, cattle cars filled with what was left of the soldiers, men with no legs, men with faces burned off by mustard gas, men screaming in Hungarian, German, Czech, and Slovak. Milada's job was to help carry them, to feed them, to write letters for the ones who had lost their hands or their eyes. And at 16 years old, she was washing the blood off the floor of a makeshift hospital ward. This experience stripped the romance out of her soul, making her realize that glory was a lie invented by old men in palaces, and that the only thing that mattered was human suffering, and the only noble pursuit was to alleviate it. She saw the incompetence of the state, how the Austrian bureaucracy couldn't feed these men, couldn't heal them, and couldn't even bury them properly. It hardened her resolve, teaching her to view the state not as a protector, but as a potential monster that would feed its own children into a meat grinder to save face, which is why she never later trusted the greater good arguments of the communists. She had seen what the greater good looked like in the gangrene wards of 1917. In 1918, the machine finally broke, the war ended, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed like a rotten structure kicked by a boot. On October 28, 1918, Czechoslovakia was born, bringing a time of delirium where the streets of Prague were filled with people crying, hugging, and tearing down the German signs as Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk returned from exile to become the president liberator. Milada was 17, a daughter of this new republic who felt a personal ownership of it, believing with the intense idealism of youth that this new country would be different, rational, just, and based on the rule of law, rather than the whim of a king. She made an aggressive decision then. She wouldn't be a doctor or a teacher, she would be a lawyer. In 1918, women in law were anomalies, the legal profession being a guild of men with cigars and connections who viewed women as too emotional for the cold logic of jurisprudence. Milada enrolled in the Faculty of Law at Charles University anyway. The photographs from this time show a woman who is striking in her intensity, with sharp features and a practical, almost severe fashion sense. She didn't dress to attract attention, she dressed to be taken seriously. She wasn't the student who merely memorized statutes, she was a ferocious debater who treated the law not as a set of abstract puzzles, but as a weapon, the only tool civilization had invented to stop the strong from crushing the weak. She studied the Czechoslovak Constitution of 1920 like it was a holy text, falling in love with its guarantees of universal suffrage and minority rights, believing that if you wrote the rules down clearly enough and had honest people to enforce them, you could prevent another 1914. She graduated in 1926 with a doctorate in law, fluent in multiple languages, a member of the new elite of a new country during the Roaring Twenties, when Prague was booming. But she didn't go into corporate law where the money was. She went to the City Council of Prague, to the Department of Social Welfare. She walked into the offices where the poor, the illiterate, and the desperate came for help, seeing the women abandoned by husbands, the illegitimate children with no legal status, and the workers fired without cause. She looked at the gap between the beautiful constitution she had studied and the ugly reality of the streets, and decided her job was to close that gap. It was there she met Bohuslav Horák, a quiet agricultural economist who fell in love with her intensity and wanted a partner, not a housewife. They married in 1927, and she became Milada Horáková, a fully formed weapon of the First Republic, armed with education, position, and the burning memory of war hospitals, ready to fix the system, not realizing that within a decade the fight would shift from fixing the system to surviving it. The years following her marriage were the high watermark of the First Republic, a deceptive era of stability that feels, in retrospect, like a collective hallucination before the roof fell in. Milada Horáková was not content to simply be a lawyer. She became an architect of the new society, joining the Czechoslovak National Socialist Party in 1929, a political organization that, despite the confusing similarity in name to the German Nazis, was its polar opposite, a center-left, progressive, and fiercely democratic bastion of the middle class. She aligned herself with Františka Plamenková, the grand dame of the Czech women's movement, and a senator who became her mentor, spiritual mother, and eventually her fellow martyr. Together, they didn't just ask for rights, they rewrote the civil code. Milada worked relentlessly on the Council of Czechoslovak Women to strip away the archaic Austrian laws that treated women as property, fighting for the legal recognition of illegitimate children, for the right of women to control their own finances, and for a social safety net that wouldn't let the poor fall into the abyss she had seen during the war. She wasn't a radical throwing bombs. She was a pragmatist throwing statutes, believing that if you built a legal system strong enough, it would act as a seawall against any future tyranny. During this period, she made a journey that would seal her fate 20 years later, traveling to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, not as a tourist, but as an observer. While many Western intellectuals visited Moscow and returned with glowing delusional reports of a worker's paradise, willfully ignoring the famine and the purges because they desperately wanted the socialist experiment to work, Milada looked at Stalin's Russia with the cold, unblinking eye of a prosecutor. She saw the Potemkin villages, the staged happiness, and the terrified silence of the people she tried to interview. She recognized the smell of a police state, the same metallic scent she had smelled under the Austrian Empire, but magnified to an industrial scale. She returned to Prague not as a convert, but as a critic, understanding earlier than almost anyone else in her circle that communism was not the liberation of the human spirit, but a new form of slavery disguised as equality. This intellectual honesty was dangerous because it meant she couldn't be bought, and it meant she couldn't be fooled. When the communists eventually came for her in 1948, they hated her specifically because she had seen behind the curtain and refused to applaud. In 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Milada gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Jana, bringing a terrifying vulnerability into her life. For a woman like Milada, who lived in the realm of logic and law, motherhood was a visceral, chaotic grounding force that raised the stakes of her political work from abstract principles to immediate survival. She wasn't a traditional mother who stayed home to bake cakes. She was a modern woman trying to balance the nursery with the parliament, often feeling the guilt of divided attention, yet driven by the conviction that the best way to love her daughter was to ensure she grew up in a free country. But the geography was against her, for Czechoslovakia was a long, thin democracy surrounded by dictatorships, a finger in the throat of Germany, as Hitler called it, and as the 1930s progressed, the shadow of the swastika began to lengthen across the border. Milada watched as the German minority in the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia, was radicalized by Nazi propaganda, turning neighbors into enemies and transforming the border towns into cauldrons of ethnic hatred. The crisis reached its boiling point in 1938, a year that stands in Czech history as the trauma from which the nation has never fully recovered. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, claiming he only wanted to liberate the German speakers, but everyone knew it was a pretext to strip Czechoslovakia of its mountain fortifications and leave it defenseless. Milada threw herself into the humanitarian crisis, working 18-hour days to help the refugees pouring into Prague, Democrats, Jews, and Czechs, fleeing the violence in the borderlands, listening to their stories of beaten shopkeepers and smashed windows, realizing that the law she loved so much was powerless against a battalion of tanks. She waited along with millions of others for the great powers to intervene, believing that France and Britain, Czechoslovakia's allies by treaty, would stand firm against the bully. She believed in the international order, in the sanctity of contracts, and in the idea that civilization would not allow a sovereign democracy to be carved up like a roast dinner. Then came Munich. On September 30th, 1938, the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met in Munich and signed the agreement that handed the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a promise of peace, all without inviting a single Czechoslovak representative to the room. A diplomatic execution known as About Us, Without Us. Milada listened to the radio broadcast, announcing the betrayal, and for the first time the foundation of her worldview cracked. The West had not just abandoned them, it had sold them to buy itself a few more months of quiet sleep. The impact on her was cataclysmic because it proved that being right didn't matter, that being democratic didn't matter, and that raw power was the only currency the world respected. She watched as President Benes resigned and fled the country, and she watched as her beloved republic was mutilated, stripped of its defenses, and reduced to a rump state dependent on Berlin. It was a moment of profound moral unease, a lesson that would haunt her. You cannot rely on foreign saviors. In the months that followed Munich, known as the Second Republic, the country began to eat itself, turning to right-wing authoritarianism in a desperate, pathetic attempt to appease Hitler. Milada was purged from her position in the social welfare department, fired for her political past and her outspoken views, but instead of retreating into the safety of domestic life, she went to work for the refugees, who were now homeless in their own country. She had contacts in London and Paris, she had a passport, and she had every reason to take 5-year-old Jana and flee while the borders were still technically open, to save her child from the coming storm. But she stayed. She stayed because she felt a crushing sense of responsibility, a belief that if the intelligentsia fled, the nation would lose its soul. And perhaps she stayed because she was stubborn, refusing to let a foreign dictator dictate where she could live. The final blow fell on the Ides of March, 1939. A blizzard was sweeping across Prague as German troops crossed the border, occupying the rest of the country without firing a shot, transforming Czechoslovakia into the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Milada stood on the streets of Prague and watched the Wehrmacht trucks roll over the cobblestones, watched the citizens weeping openly, some raising their fists in futile defiance, others raising their right arms in collaboration. She saw Adolf Hitler look out from the window of Prague Castle, claiming the ancient seat of Czech kings as his own. And in that moment, the lawyer died and the conspirator was born. She realized that the law was dead, that the courts were now just theaters for the occupiers, and that the only way to fight for justice was to break the law. She went home, burned her sensitive papers, and began to reach out to the shadows, joining the underground resistance not because she wanted to be a hero, but because the alternative was to be a slave. The script for her life had changed from a legal drama to a war story, and she was ready to play her part, unaware that the curtain was already rising on the tragedy that would end in pancrack. The transition from a respectable civil servant to a high-ranking member of the underground resistance was not a dramatic leap for Milada, but a logical extension of her legal philosophy. If the law is suspended, then resistance becomes the only lawful act. She joined the petition committee We Remain Faithful, PVVZ, a resistance network composed largely of the non-communist intelligentsia, socialists, Democrats, and trade unionists who operated on the dangerous conviction that intelligence was a weapon as lethal as dynamite. For a year, she lived a schizophrenic existence, walking the gray streets of occupied Prague by day as a defeated bureaucrat, and spending her nights in the shadows, organizing safe houses for fleeing Jews, passing intelligence reports to London, and knitting together the frayed edges of a nation that was being systematically dismantled. It was a life of suffocating paranoia where every telephone click was a potential death sentence, every glance from a neighbor was a potential betrayal, and the double knock on the door at 3 a.m. was the sound that haunted the dreams of an entire city. Milada did not play the role of the romantic spy. She was a logistical genius of survival, using her organizational skills to keep the network alive, fully aware that the Gestapo was tearing through the Czech resistance with terrifying efficiency, closing the net around her circle one by one. The net finally closed on August 2nd, 1940. They didn't come in the middle of the night. They came in the banal light of day, arresting both Milada and her husband Bohuslav, dragging them into the maw of the Nazi security apparatus. She was taken to Peček Palace, the feared Pečkárna, a former bank turned into the Gestapo headquarters, where the vaults were converted into torture chambers and the walls were soundproofed to absorb the screams of the dying. The interrogation that followed was a contest of wills between the brute force of the totalitarian state and the disciplined mind of a constitutional lawyer. The Gestapo officers, accustomed to breaking victims through pain and fear, found themselves confounded by a woman who, even while bleeding, calculated her answers with the precision of a chess player. She quickly realized that the Nazis did not know the full extent of her network, so she adopted a strategy of containment, confessing to lesser crimes and taking exaggerated responsibility for her own actions, in order to shield her colleagues and her husband. She spun a web of half-truths and legalistic obfuscations that frustrated her interrogators, buying time and saving lives with nothing but her intellect. proving that even in a torture chamber, the mind is the last fortress to fall. From the interrogation room, she was moved to Theresienstadt, the Little Fortress, a transit camp that served as the waiting room for the gas chambers of the East. Here, the horror was not the sharp shock of interrogation, but the slow, grinding degradation of the human spirit, the lice, the dysentery, the constant hunger that turned grown men into skeletons, and the random cruelty of guards who killed for sport. It was in Terezin that she had her final, heartbreaking encounter with Františka Plamenková, her mentor and the woman who had taught her that feminism and democracy were inseparable. Plamenková, nearing 70, was broken in body but not in spirit, waiting for her own execution, which would come in the wake of the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942. Watching her mentor march to her death while she herself was kept alive was a specific kind of survivor's guilt that calcified Milada's soul. She realized that survival in a totalitarian system is not a reward for virtue, but a random accounting error, a cosmic joke that leaves the living with the crushing burden of owing a debt to the dead. She spent nearly 2 years in Terezin, living in the shadow of the chimney, witnessing the industrialization of murder and hardening herself against the luxury of hope. In 1944, she was transferred to Germany to stand trial in Dresden, a city that would soon be incinerated by Allied bombers. The Nazi prosecutor demanded the death penalty, classifying her as a dangerous enemy of the Reich, a title she wore with silent pride. Standing before the Nazi judge, she defended herself in fluent German, not begging for mercy but arguing points of law, turning the courtroom into a surreal theater where a prisoner lectured her captors on justice. Miraculously, perhaps because the judge was an old-school bureaucrat who respected her legal precision, or perhaps because the war was visibly turning against Germany, her sentence was commuted to 8 years of hard labor, a verdict that was essentially a slow death sentence, but not an immediate one. She was moved to the Aichach Women's Prison near Munich, where she spent the final year of the war in solitary confinement, manufacturing simple goods for the German war effort while her body wasted away. She survived on a diet of watery soup and memories, keeping her mind sharp by reciting poetry and reconstructing legal arguments in the dark, refusing to let the isolation erode her identity. The end came in May 1945, not with a bang, but with the rumble of American tanks. The doors of Aichach were thrown open, and the 101st Airborne Division walked into a scene of medieval squalor, finding living skeletons who wept at the sight of chocolate and cigarettes. Milada Horáková emerged from the darkness of the Third Reich at the age of 43, physically shattered, her teeth loose, her eyes sunken, but mentally unbreakable. She had stared into the abyss of fascism for 5 years and had not blinked. She had learned that the only thing that matters is the integrity of the individual against the crushing weight of the collective. She returned to Prague in a cattle car, traveling through a ruined Europe, carrying a set of values that had been tempered in the fire, a hatred of dictatorship that was no longer theoretical but visceral, and a belief in freedom that was absolute and uncompromising. She thought the war was over. She thought the victory was won, not realizing that the trauma of the camps had prepared her not for peace, but for the next war. She walked back into a liberated Prague with the dangerous fearlessness of a woman who has already died once, unaware that this very quality, this refusal to be afraid, was exactly what would make her intolerable to the new masters arriving from the East. The period between May 1945 and February 1948 is often remembered in Czech history as the Third Republic, but a more accurate description would be a 3-year hallucination of freedom before the cage door slammed shut. Milada returned to Prague in a state of euphoric exhaustion, reunited with her husband Bohuslav, who had miraculously survived a Nazi death march, and her daughter Jana, who was now a stranger of 12 years old, a child who had grown up waiting for parents who might never return. For a brief moment, it seemed that the nightmare was over, that the suffering had been the currency used to purchase a new era of democracy, and Milada threw herself back into politics with the frantic energy of a woman trying to make up for lost time. She was re-elected to parliament, she became the chairwoman of the Council of Czechoslovak Women, and she traveled the country speaking about the necessity of preserving human rights against the encroachments of the state. However, the Prague she returned to was not the cosmopolitan city of the 1920s. It was a harder, angrier place where the Red Army was viewed not just as liberators, but as the new masters, and where the Communist Party was systematically seizing control of the police, the radio, and the trade unions, using the prestige of the Soviet victory to mask their totalitarian ambitions. Milada saw the rot setting in earlier than most, noticing how the Ministry of the Interior, controlled by the Communists, was turning into a new Gestapo, disappearing critics and intimidating opposition, and she refused to stay silent, using her parliamentary immunity to ask dangerous questions that made her the primary target of the emerging regime. The political atmosphere became a suffocating game of salami tactics, where the communists sliced away the opposition piece by piece, accusing democratic leaders of being reactionaries, collaborators, or spies for the West. Milada stood in the center of this storm as a member of the National Socialist Party, the only major bulwark against the communist tide, and she became the voice of an uncomfortable conscience that the communists were desperate to silence. She publicly criticized the people's courts, which were delivering justice with the subtlety of a lynch mob, and she warned against the blind idolization of the Soviet Union, arguing that trading Berlin for Moscow was not liberation but merely a change of prison guards. This was a lethal miscalculation of the nature of her enemy, for she was operating under the assumption that she was in a parliamentary democracy where debate was protected, not realizing she was already in a war zone where her words were being transcribed by secret police agents and filed away as evidence for a treason trial that was already being planned. She believed that her status as a survivor of Nazi concentration camps gave her a moral shield, a naive belief that even the communists wouldn't dare touch a woman who bore the scars of the anti-fascist resistance. But to the men in the Kremlin and their Czech puppets, her heroism made her more dangerous, not less, because a hero who opposes you is a threat that must be destroyed, not just defeated. The catastrophe arrived in February 1948, a cold month that froze the heart of the nation. The Democratic ministers in the government resigned en masse in a desperate gamble to force early elections and stop the communist takeover, but they had severely underestimated the ruthlessness of Prime Minister Clement Gottwald. Instead of calling elections, the communists armed the people's militias, factory workers given rifles and armbands, and deployed them to the streets of Prague, turning a political crisis into an armed coup. Milada watched from the windows of the parliament as the police occupied the ministries and the action committees began purging non-communists from every office, school, and factory in the country. The final blow came when President Edvard Beneš, old, sick, and terrified of a civil war, capitulated to the communist demands, signing the death warrant of Czechoslovak democracy. The suicide or murder of Jan Masaryk, the popular foreign minister and son of the nation's founder, whose broken body was found beneath his bathroom window shortly after the coup, was the bloody punctuation mark that signaled the end of the rule of law. The Third Republic was dead, replaced by the people's democracy, a cynical euphemism for a Stalinist dictatorship. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, the borders were still porous, and the window for escape remained open for a few terrified weeks. Friends in the diplomatic corps, British and American contacts, and fellow resistance fighters urged Milada to leave, having cars ready to smuggle her and her family into the American zone in Germany. It would have been easy. She had the connections, she had the justification, and she knew exactly what happened to opposition leaders in Soviet-style regimes. Yet, for the second time in her life, she chose to stay in the burning house. She resigned her seat in Parliament in a defiant protest against the coup, but she refused to abandon her country, telling her friends, "I cannot run away. The people need to know that someone stayed." This decision was driven by a complex mix of patriotism, stubbornness, and a fatal inability to comprehend the sheer scale of the evil she was facing. She anticipated prison. She anticipated harassment, perhaps even a show trial. But her legalistic mind could not conceive that the state would murder a woman for political disagreement. She went back to work, organizing underground networks to help others escape, becoming a lighthouse on a rocky shore, guiding others to safety while she herself remained stationary, waiting for the wave that she knew was coming to sweep her away. The knock on the door came on September 27th, 1949, not in the dead of night as the cliches of noir fiction would suggest, but in the mundane light of a Tuesday morning while she was at her office on Masna Street. The men who arrested her were not the uniformed thugs of the Gestapo, but the plainclothes agents of the STB, the state security, men who looked like clerks and accountants, but who were architects of a new kind of hell. Milada Horáková was driven to Ruzina prison, a fortress on the outskirts of Prague that would become the stage for the systematic dismantling of her identity. Unlike her experience with the Nazis, where the brutality was physical and reactive, the violence at Ruzina was psychological, scientific, and directed by advisors flown in from Moscow to teach their Czech pupils the dark arts of the Soviet show trial. These advisors, men who had cut their teeth during Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s, viewed the prisoner not as a source of information but as raw material to be molded into a specific shape. They did not want the truth, for the truth was messy and inconvenient. They wanted a narrative. The interrogation began immediately and did not stop, operating on the conveyor belt system, where teams of interrogators worked in shifts around the clock, while the prisoner was kept awake for days, weeks on end. They stripped Milada of her name and gave her a number. They stripped her of sleep until reality began to fracture, and the waking world became indistinguishable from a nightmare, and they stripped her of dignity, forcing her to march endlessly in her cell until her legs swelled and her mind unspooled. The goal was to induce a state of absolute malleability, a zombie-like compliance where the victim would agree to anything just to be allowed to close their eyes for 5 minutes. But Milada was a terrifying anomaly in their system. Her mind, honed by years of legal discipline and tempered by the Nazi camps, refused to shatter. She debated her tormentors, pointing out contradictions in their accusations and correcting their grammar in the protocols, driving the interrogators to fits of rage because she treated the torture chamber like a courtroom and refused to play the role of the frightened victim. When physical exhaustion failed to break her, they turned to emotional evisceration, leveraging her deepest love against her highest principles. They lied to her with sociopathic precision, telling her that her husband Bohuslav had been captured and was being tortured in the next room, playing recordings of screams that they claimed were his, and telling her that her 16-year-old daughter Jana would be thrown onto the street, or worse if she did not cooperate. They presented her with a choice that was no choice at all: confess to being a traitor and save your family, or remain stubborn and watch everyone you love be destroyed. It was a calculus designed to break the strongest of men, and indeed many of her co-defendants, hardened resistance fighters and soldiers, crumbled under this specific pressure, agreeing to recite the lines written for them, just to spare their wives and children. Milada, however, realized something they did not. The promise of mercy was a lie. She understood that the regime would destroy her family, regardless of what she did, and that her only remaining power was the preservation of her own integrity, the refusal to let them rewrite her life story into a sordid tale of espionage and greed. The monster process, as the trial came to be known, was not a legal proceeding in any recognizable sense. It was a scripted theater production, a tragic play written by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The StB literally typed out a script, a thick dossier containing the prosecutor's questions and the defendant's required answers, and forced the prisoners to memorize it like actors preparing for opening night. They held dress rehearsals in the prison, beating anyone who fluffed their lines or lacked the appropriate tone of contrition, ensuring that when the cameras rolled, the performance would be flawless. Milada was cast in the role of the mastermind, the villainous puppet of Western imperialism who hated the working class, but she was a bad actor. She would memorize the general gist of the accusations to avoid further torture, but she refused to memorize the specific words, maintaining a dangerous independence that terrified the producers of this grim spectacle. As the trial date approached in May 1950, the atmosphere in Ruzhenya became electric with a macabre anticipation. The prosecutors, led by the fanatical Josef Orvalek and the venomous Ludmila Brozhova-Polednova, were nervous because they knew Milada was diverging from the plan during the rehearsals, arguing back and qualifying her confessions with legal nuances that ruined the propaganda value. They increased the pressure, subjecting her to the cold room, keeping her in darkness, and denying her medical care. But the woman who emerged from the cell block was not the broken husk they had ordered. She was gaunt, she was exhausted, and she was in pain, but her head was high, and her eyes burned with a cold, defiant light. She was ready to walk onto the stage they had built and turn their own production against them, knowing full well that the final act of this play required her death, but determining that if she had to die, she would die as Milada Horáková, the lawyer and patriot, not as the caricature they had written on their typewriters. On May 31st, 1950, the curtain rose on the final act of the tragedy in the grand jury room of Pancrac Prison, a space that had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a hall of justice. The room was packed not with impartial observers, but with a carefully selected audience of workers' representatives, young communists, and secret police agents, all instructed to hiss, boo, and laugh on cue, turning the solemnity of a capital trial into the raucous atmosphere of a gladiatorial arena. Microphones hung from the ceiling like vipers, and film cameras whirred in the corners, capturing every twitch and grimace for the newsreels that would be shown in cinemas across the country before the main feature. This was the first televised trial in Czechoslovak history, broadcast live on the radio to factories and schools where attendance was mandatory, designed to be a masterclass in the crushing power of the state. The prosecutors, led by the frenetic Josef Orvalek and the novice Ludmila Brozhova Polednova sat behind desks piled high with fabricated evidence, ready to destroy the woman standing alone in the dock. Milada Horáková stood before them, dressed in her own clothes which hung loosely on her emaciated frame, stripped of her glasses to make her look weak and disoriented. Yet she gripped the railing with a strength that belied her physical condition, staring into the lenses of the cameras with an unsettling calmness. As the trial commenced, the script seemed to hold. The other 12 defendants, broken men who had been tortured into submission, recited their confessions in monotone robotic voices, admitting to grotesque crimes of espionage and sabotage that never happened, sounding less like human beings and more like broken records playing a warped tune. But when it was Milada's turn to speak, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. She stepped to the microphone, and instead of the trembling apology the prosecutors expected, she began to speak in the clear, measured tones of the doctor of law she was. She did not scream, she did not beg, and most dangerously, she did not lie. She admitted to her political activities, admitted to opposing the communist coup of 1948, and admitted to maintaining contact with exiles in the West, but she fundamentally rejected the criminal framing of these actions. "I stand by my convictions," she told the court, drawing a sharp surgical line between treason against the nation, which she denied, and opposition to the Communist Party, which she proudly confessed. This distinction was her weapon, a logical razor she used to slash through the prosecutor's conflation of the party with the state, and it sent the courtroom into chaos. The prosecutors, unprepared for a defendant who debated them on points of constitutional law, lost their composure entirely. Joseph Orvalek, the chief prosecutor, began to scream, his face flushing red as he abandoned legal arguments for incoherent political slogans, banging his fist on the table and shouting over her answers in a desperate attempt to drown out her logic. But the most chilling dynamic was between Milada and Ludmila Brozhova Polednova, the 29-year-old female prosecutor who had been brought in specifically to destroy Milada's image as a mother and wife. Brozhova Polednova did not act like a lawyer. She acted like a fanatical street brawler, attacking Milada with a visceral feminine hatred, accusing her of abandoning her daughter to serve foreign masters and mocking her principles with a shrill, hysterical self-righteousness. It was a clash of archetypes. The elder stateswoman representing the dignified humanist tradition of the First Republic versus the young, indoctrinated zealot representing the brutal, anti-intellectual future. The radio listeners, huddled around receivers in workshops and living rooms, heard the difference clearly. The hysterical shrieking of the accusers versus the calm, intelligent voice of the accused, and even the most loyal communists felt a flicker of doubt, a realization that the woman in the dock was the only sane person in the room. Outside the courtroom, the regime orchestrated a carnival of hatred to ensure the verdict would be accepted by the masses. The Communist Party mobilized the population, forcing factory workers, school children, and office clerks to sign petitions demanding the death penalty for the traitor Horáková. Sacks of letters flooded the court, filled with venomous demands for her execution, some written by people who had never heard of her a week prior, others signed by entire collectives who risked losing their rations if they refused. The windows of the courtroom were left open so the chants of the organized crowds outside could drift in, a constant auditory reminder to the judges that the mob was waiting. Milada heard the chants. She heard her own people calling for her blood, but she did not falter. She understood that this was not the voice of the Czech nation, but the voice of fear, the sound of millions of people terrified that if they didn't scream loud enough, they would be next in the dock. She treated the court not as a place to save her life, but as a platform to leave a final testament, speaking over the interruptions of the judge to articulate a defense of liberty that she knew would be erased from the official record, but remembered by those who heard it. The trial lasted 8 days, a marathon of exhaustion, where Milada was forced to stand for hours answering questions while drifting in and out of consciousness due to lack of sleep and food. Yet in the final statements on June 8, 1950, she delivered a closing speech that was a masterpiece of moral courage. She did not plead for mercy. She accepted the inevitability of the sentence with a stoic grace that silenced the room. "I have lost this battle," she said, her voice raspy but unbroken, "but I leave with my head held high. I have not lied. I have not betrayed my conscience." The judges, glancing nervously at the Soviet advisors sitting in the gallery, delivered the verdict that had been typed out in Moscow months before: death by hanging. The courtroom erupted in staged applause. The prosecutors smiled for the cameras, and Milada Horáková stood motionless in the center of the storm, a solitary figure of dignity amidst a whirlwind of moral rot, listening to her death sentence as if it were a judgment on the court itself rather than on her. The 19 days between the verdict on June 8th and the execution on June 27th were a period of grotesque political theater played out on the global stage, contrasting sharply with the quiet, suffocating solitude of Milada's death row cell. While she sat in the damp silence of Prague, preparing her soul for the end, the world outside erupted in a desperate, furious campaign to save her, with telegrams flooding the desk of President Clement Gottwald from the most luminous minds of the 20th century. Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Bertrand Russell all wrote to the communist leadership pleading not for justice, which they knew was impossible, but for simple human mercy, arguing that executing a woman for political crimes would be a stain that history would never wash away. Gottwald, however, was a man paralyzed by his own subservience to Moscow, a president who was terrified that any show of leniency would be interpreted by Stalin as weakness. He read the telegrams, he likely drank heavily, as was his habit, and then he signed the death warrant with a steady hand, proving that in a totalitarian system, the conscience of the individual is the first casualty of power. Milada knew this. She had no illusions about a last-minute reprieve, and while her lawyer filed a plea for clemency as a formality, she spent her final days not in hope, but in a state of radical acceptance, writing, praying, and organizing her emotional legacy. The cruelest moment came on the evening of June 26th, the night before the execution, when the authorities allowed her family a final 20-minute visit, a calculated act of psychological torture disguised as humanitarianism. Her 16-year-old daughter Jana, her sister, and her elderly father were brought into a room divided by a double wire mesh, preventing any physical touch, any final embrace, or even a clear view of each other's faces. Milada, ravaged by months of interrogation and impending death, summoned a reserve of strength that borders on the supernatural. She did not cry, she did not scream, and she explicitly forbade her family from breaking down, taking command of the room with the authority of a mother protecting her brood. She smiled at Jana, joking about small things, asking about school, and giving instructions on how to live a good life, shielding her daughter from the terror of the moment by acting as if she were merely going on a long journey. It was a performance more heroic than her defiance in the courtroom, because it required her to suppress her own primal terror, to ensure that her daughter's last memory of her would be one of strength, not despair, a final gift of love delivered through a wire cage. After her family was led away, leaving her alone in the crushing silence of the final night, Milada sat down to write the letters that would become her true testament, pouring her soul onto scraps of paper with a pencil stub. She wrote 10 letters in total to her husband, her mother-in-law, her sister, and most painfully to Jana, creating a moral roadmap for the people she was leaving behind. To her daughter, she wrote words that vibrate with a timeless, aching love. I shall pray for you. Go through the world with open eyes and listen not only to your own pains and interests, but also to the pains, interests, and longings of others. Don't be sad. Life is still hard. It does not pamper anyone, and for the time being, it will not pamper you. These were not the rantings of a bitter victim, but the measured advice of a philosopher facing the void. In an act of consummate spite that defines the pettiness of the regime, the secret police confiscated these letters immediately after her death. They did not deliver them to the grieving family, but filed them away in a dusty archive labeled Top Secret, deciding that even her dead voice was too dangerous to be heard. Jana would not read her mother's final words until 1990, waiting 40 years to receive the love and guidance that was stolen from her on that June night. The dawn of June 27, 1950, broke gray and cold over Prague as the prison guards came to collect Milada Horáková at 5 a.m., leading her from her cell for the final walk to the execution yard. She was the last of the 4 condemned prisoners to die that morning, forced to wait while her colleagues, Zavish Kalandra, John Buchal, and Oldrich Petzel, were killed one by one, the sounds of the preparations drifting into her holding area. She dressed with meticulous care in the clothes she had worn at the trial, maintaining her dignity to the literal end, refusing to be dragged to the gallows like an animal. When she stepped out into the courtyard, she saw the crude execution device, not a gallows with a trapdoor designed to break the neck instantly, but a simple vertical pole with a hook near the top, a primitive Austro-Hungarian method known as strangulation by pole. This method was intentionally cruel. It did not offer the mercy of a quick death, but ensured a slow, agonizing asphyxiation, where the prisoner would struggle for air while the executioner's assistant pulled down on their legs to tighten the noose. She walked to the pole without assistance, looking small and fragile against the brutality of the machinery and the men surrounding her. The executioner placed the noose around her neck, and as the rough hemp tightened, she spoke her final words, not to the men killing her, but to the sky and the land she loved. I fall. I've lost this fight. I go honorably, she whispered, her voice straining against the rope. I love this country. I love this people. Build the welfare of the nation. I go without hatred towards you. I wish you that. I wish you. The executioner signaled, and the gruesome mechanics of the state took over. It was not quick. The medical records indicate that she struggled for nearly 15 minutes, her heart refusing to stop beating, her body fighting for life even as the state crushed the breath out of her. At 5:35 a.m., the doctor finally pronounced her dead. Her body was cut down, placed in a simple coffin, and trucked to a crematorium where it was burned, and her ashes were disposed of in an unmarked location, denied even the final dignity of a grave. The regime believed that by erasing her body and stealing her letters, they had erased her existence, unaware that they had just created a martyr who would outlive their entire empire. For 40 years, the communist regime believed they had successfully solved the problem of Milada Horáková by reducing her to ash and scattering her remains in the winds of a cold Prague winter, enforcing a damnatio memoriae so absolute that speaking her name became a dangerous act of sedition. In the history books approved by the party, she was reduced to a footnote, a caricature of a bourgeois trader who had plotted to sell the country to imperialists, while her family was left to navigate the wreckage of their lives in a society designed to punish them for her existence. Her husband Bohuslav, who had escaped to West Germany and eventually to the United States, spent the rest of his life in a frantic, agonizing attempt to clear his wife's name from afar, dying in Washington, D.C. in 1976 without ever seeing his homeland or his daughter again. Jana, the 16-year-old girl left behind at the wire fence, was raised by her aunt in a Prague that treated her as a pariah. She was denied entry to universities, denied decent employment, and forced to live under the constant, suffocating surveillance of the same secret police who had murdered her mother. The regime did not just want Milada dead. They wanted to prove that defiance was futile, that the state could crush a legacy as easily as it crushed a neck. And for decades, amidst the gray stagnation of the normalization era, it seemed they had succeeded. But history is a patient judge, and the script the communists wrote began to unravel in November 1989, when the Velvet Revolution swept through the streets of Prague, and the terrified apparatchiks began shredding documents in the basements of the Ministry of the Interior. As the totalitarian ice melted, the truth of the 1950 show trials resurfaced with the force of a suppressed trauma. The archives were opened and the transcripts of Milada's defiance were published for a new generation that had never been allowed to know her. The most shattering moment came in 1990, when the new democratic government finally located the letters Milada had written on her last night, the letters the STB had stolen and hidden in a safe for 4 decades. Jana, now a woman in her late 50s, finally held the yellowed paper in her hands and read the words her mother had written in the shadow of the gallows, a message of love traveling across time to close a circle that had been broken by violence. It was a moment of profound vindication, a proof that while the regime could kill the writer, they could not kill the words, and Milada returned to the national consciousness not as a victim, but as a secular saint, the moral compass of a nation finding its way back to democracy. However, if this story were a fairy tale, it would end there with statues raised and justice served. But history is not a fairy tale, and the ending of Milada's story is defined by a lingering, nauseating sense of injustice without closure. The woman who had sent her to her death, the fanatical prosecutor Ludmila Brozowa-Polednova, was still alive, living a comfortable, quiet life in a provincial town, collecting a state pension funded by the very taxpayers she had terrorized. For decades, she had faced no consequences, shielding herself behind the claim that she was just following orders and upholding the laws of the time, displaying a terrifying lack of remorse that mirrored the banality of evil itself. When Democratic prosecutors finally moved to indict her in the 2000s, the legal system moved with agonizing slowness, hampered by statutes of limitations and the reluctance of the courts to put an old woman on trial. It was not until 2008, 58 years after the execution, that Brozowa-Polednova, then 86 years old and half-blind, was finally convicted of judicial murder. The sight of the elderly prosecutor in court, complaining about her health and insisting with a senile stubbornness that Milada Horáková had been a traitor who deserved to die, was a grotesque spectacle that offered no catharsis, only a reminder of how much time had been stolen. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but the justice was symbolic and hollow. She served only a year and a half in a minimum security facility before being released by a presidential pardon due to her age and failing health. She died in her sleep in a hospital bed in 2015, at the age of 93, having lived 45 years longer than the woman she murdered. There was no rope for her, no interrogation room, no 15 minutes of strangulation. She passed away in peace, unrepentant to her last breath, creating a moral asymmetry that makes the blood boil. The contrast is the final bitter pill of this story. Milada Horáková, the innocent, died in agony at 48. Ludmila Brozhova Polednova, the guilty, died in comfort at 93. There is no cosmic balance here, no divine retribution that evens the score, only the cold reality that in the real world, the villains often grow old and the heroes rot in unmarked graves. Hers is not a story of victory, for she lost the fight for her life, nor is it a story of justice, for her killers largely escaped punishment. It is instead a testament to the human conscience in the face of total power. When Milada Horáková stood before the microphone in 1950, she had the option to live. She could have read the lines, she could have begged, she could have chosen the quiet shame of survival over the public glory of martyrdom. By refusing to do so, she stripped the regime of its power to define reality, proving that while they could control her body, they could not occupy her mind. She left us with a terrifying question that echoes every time we look at her photograph. Knowing the outcome, knowing the pain, knowing the rope was waiting, would we have the courage to tear up the script? Her life suggests that there are things more valuable than survival, and that even when you lose the fight, how you choose to lose matters more than the defeat itself. She fell, as she said, honorably, but in falling, she rose higher than the men who killed her, leaving behind a silence that screams louder than any prosecutor ever could.